Thanks. Thank you. Yeah, so I think Deshal gave a good overview of the very difficult task ahead for Sri Lanka in terms of the economic recovery. What I'm focusing more on is what we are doing with a lot of corporates, both locally and globally, in terms of how to help them navigate through these crises and some of the steps that they are taking. It's really, the corporate sector has a big part to play in accelerating our rebound from the impending recession. And, in these type of global events, when there's a global downturn of this magnitude, often what you see is there are corporates that really thrive in the uptick and become billion-dollar companies. I mean, if you take the example of Alibaba after SARS, really Alibaba's growth trajectory increased after SARS because of the consumption patterns changed as a result of SARS. Or if you take Ryanair, which is one of the most successful budget airlines, what the founder of Ryanair did was, after 9/11, there were a lot of planes that were out there to be bought at a very discounted rate, and he went and started spending and buying all these inventory of planes, and then created Ryanair, and rest is history. So billion-dollar companies that are going to be formed as a result of this downturn, and what we as Sri Lankans should aspire to be is to become one or two of those $1 billion companies. So what can we do to do that? For us, from my view, I feel that the global economy is still very much dependent on the US economy. And really understanding what the US economy does will have a significant role for us in our recovery. Even today, the largest single export market for Sri Lanka is the US. It accounts for about 25% of our total manufacturing export bill. So if you look at, if you go to the next slide, Rai, there are different scenarios that can be mapped in terms of the GDP recovery, the global recovery and the US recovery. Initially, when this pandemic happened, most economists were saying, hey, it could be a V-shaped recovery, which is A4 in this chart. But increasingly, once we started understanding the nature of COVID-19, it is increasingly likely that the recovery is going to either be A3 or A1. And based on today's information, what most economists are predicting is an A1 type recovery for the US market. A1 is really what is now coined the hammer and dance recovery, where you have a forced lockdown where pretty much the entire economy comes to a standstill, and then slowly start opening up the economy. But there will be a dance scenario where there'll be instances, pockets of this virus coming up, and then forced lockdowns in certain pockets of certain regions. So it's going to be a ebb and flow type recovery. Now, what does this mean for the US economy? Now, if you go to the next slide, then the next slide, right? Yeah, so if you go to the next slide, this slide really talks about the US economic impact and charted with two scenarios. The A3 scenario, which is kind of a stable U-shaped recovery, or the A1 scenario where there is kind of the hammer and dance scenario. And if you see, most likely what folks are predicting is the A1, that is a 13% decline from the peak. And that rivals the 1950s post-World War II downturn. So this is serious there's a serious economic impact in the US and as a result to the global economy. And if you look at the 1930s was the Great Depression, and 1910 was 1918, around 1918 was the Spanish flu. So just so that in comparison, what the downturn would look like. The next slide. So what we know is there was certain, so that we talked about there's going to be a structural shift in how we operate as individuals, governments, and businesses. And how can local businesses, how Sri Lankan businesses, how can we take advantage of this? There were 4 real trends that were happening way before COVID. These were trends that were happening globally, and we were kind of getting accustomed to these trends. What COVID has done is these trends have been accelerated at a rapid pace, and post-COVID, it's going to become mainstream. It's going to become part and parcel of our new normal. So these 4 trends that we're seeing is, one is virtualization of events, activities, and interactions. What we're doing right now today, right? That's going to become commonplace. Automation of processes and services. The focus on customer intimacy and centricity. Before, if you look at any corporation, the focus was on supply chain. And I'm not saying supply chain is still important, but increasingly, customer intimacy and customer centricity is going to become more important than focusing on the supply chain. But supply chain becomes more and more given. And the 4th element is the political and economic decentralization. Now, sitting here today, we'll be like, okay, what are you talking about? It's actually going towards becoming more more centralized as opposed to decentralized. But if you look at what's happening globally, if you take the US, for example, funding to organizations such as the WHO and others are going to shrink over time, which is already happening. You can see the tussle between the federal government in the US and individual states. So these are, for example, New York State Governor Cuomo and President Trump. There is contentious contention between the 2 parties. So that type of decentralization is going to become mainstream going forward, especially with the other 3 trends coming up. So because when you have cashless societies, when you have virtualization of events, decentralization becomes possible. If you go to the next slide, it really talks about some of the innovations that are already underway. These are some that we found in different countries, from robotics being used for carrying food to disinfecting to even doing tours of real estate, showing houses by using robotic measures. Autonomous vehicles are now actually being used to deliver food in quarantined areas. Drones are used to walk dogs in this crisis, to check temperatures of large gatherings and identify folks who have high temperatures. And then startup, and Mano will talk about all the startup sphere is going to kind of really bubble with this, because there's going to be so many opportunities for new startups to take advantage. And some have already started with smart bands that alert you not to touch your face, and others coming up. If you go to the next slide, this shows you some of the industries that we are working with and that we are seeing, that is having, categorized into 6 areas: short-term boost, long-term stability, short-term boost, long-term growth, etc. And what we've listed out here is some of the emerging industries, especially from a short-term boost perspective from teleconference, telehealth, online pharmacies, as well as some areas that would really take a hit. For example, traditional retailers may never come back to where it was. And then you have places like tourism, commercial construction, restaurants, which will take a short-term hit, but will take a long-time recovery, will be in the long-term recovery arc. If you go to the next slide, the next slide talks about what we're seeing, what our clients are asking from us, and what we feel is really important at this time to really become and take advantage of the uptick. If you bucketed it into 3 areas. One is enhancing resilience across people, process, and technology. So improving remote connectivity, merging different systems. If you go to most companies, there are disparate server-based technology systems out there. How do you bring it into one system to make it cloud-based, etc.? That's kind of one bucket. The other bucket is really ensuring cash flow and stability for the long haul. So really focusing on making sure that you have enough cash flow and you manage your cash flow that you can survive for the 6 to 12 month period. That's critical, because it's no point having all these ideas and burning your cash in the first 3 months of this pandemic and then not having cash to survive and be relevant during the uptick. So there's very important to kind of really focus on that area. The third bucket is really the 6 month priority plan. Really focusing today on what are our strategic initiatives that we need to prioritize, what are new initiatives that are needed to become successful in the new normal and become potentially $1 billion company. We need to aspire, our companies, especially our larger companies, should aspire to become one of the giants globally, because this allows us to really take advantage of trends that are happening. Finally, I know my 5 minutes is up, so the final slide really talks about, I'm going to leave you with a quote, which is kind of a successful company needs to maintain a heightened sense of crisis. And that's critical, I think. When we come out of this, we need to always operate as a company in this kind of mode, because this will bring us the best out of us, of our corporate leaders, and all of us to really aspire and become successful. Yeah. That's it, Disha.